The Mice and Men is a novel set in America during the Depression of the 1930s. Now, if we go back to the 1920s, America is really prosperous. The people are enjoying unknown levels of wealth, partly because they're using credit cards or credit systems to pay for things. And there's a lot of inventions, new inventions. So things like cars for the first time become available. So people, and affordable as well. So people become wealthy and they have things to spend their money on. So in the 20s, everything is fantastic. Party time in America. 1929, history students will know, is the Wall Street crash. The financial markets collapse, the banks panic, they withdraw their money from the businesses, and businesses go bust. They also withdraw people's personal savings, or they call back the loans people have made, and people suddenly find themselves without jobs and often in huge debt. Terrific catastrophe, which actually spreads out across the whole world because so many countries relied on America's financial system. But in America itself, society was in danger of collapsing. 1 in 3 Americans became unemployed as a result of the Wall Street crash. There are lots of stories going around of people who 1 week are working in an office in New York, in a big company, who are extremely wealthy, and a week later are breaking into people's gardens to try and steal apples off trees to feed their families. A phenomenon starts called the carpet baggers, people who are driven out of their homes. They can't afford to pay their mortgages anymore, and so they have to cut a square of carpet off the floor of their house, fold it up and turn it into a bag and put as many of their possessions as they can into it, and then that's that. So massive collapse in American society. So industry and business collapses in America, but people still have to eat, and so perhaps agriculture might be able to cope with this. Unfortunately, moving into a job in the countryside, working on a farm, wasn't as simple as it seemed, partly because so many people were trying to do it. You don't really want to have lots and lots of people turning up at your farm asking for work. You can't pay their wages. So there were limited jobs. Also, totally ironically, at the same time as the financial crash, there was an environmental disaster in America. Very dry summer, so the main areas in the west, which provided an awful lot of the crops for America, the soil dried out. Then it was followed by really strong winds, which blew that topsoil away. And the topsoil, geography fans, is what you need to grow plants efficiently and effectively. So the soil, the land was ruined, and what was described as the Dust Bowl. Dust everywhere. Remarkable footage there is. Look on Google, look on YouTube of dust storms, places completely buried, villages partly buried in dust. It was a terrible environmental disaster, and it meant that farming collapsed as well. There was supposed to be one positive place, California. Out on the west coast was supposed to be a perfect land where everything was still fine, and so people moved in massive numbers. John Steinbeck, who writes of Mice and Men, one of his other great novels, The Grapes of Wrath, is about a family who uprooted, been kicked out of their farm, and they all moved to California looking for the promised land. It doesn't pan out like that for most people, because California, as I mentioned earlier, is going to get full. And so the Californians tend to drive people away. They don't want to let migrants come in. And so you've got this terrible situation where there are lots of people who are homeless, who are searching around, looking for work, looking to work in farms, in ranches, for whatever. Some of them manage to find temporary accommodation. Some of them live in shanty towns called Hoovervilles, after the president, which are basically just towns made out of waste and rubbish and bits of metal that you can find. And some people, including Lenny and George, the characters in Of Mice and Men, will just move from farm to farm. Basically, get a job. It's a cheap labour job, but it's a job, and they'll give you enough food to survive and a bed to sleep in. As you've seen Of Mice and Men, not necessarily the best accommodation, but when you're homeless, you're going to take it. So, massive collapse in American society, both in terms of industry, in terms of business, and also in terms of agriculture. A huge problem, which is in the short term alleviated by President Roosevelt trying to do lots of public work programs to try and give people work, to give them some sort of purpose and keep them positive, even if it's poorly paid. But ultimately, and you don't need to know this of Mice and Men, but the real thing that actually ends the depression is the Second World War. When the country goes to war, they convert to a war economy. People are sent off to fight, and ironically enough, that is what ends the depression in essence. It's also a cruel environment, as you can imagine, living on these ranches. This is full of tough gut men, mostly men. Women wouldn't be expected to go working on the farms. You can imagine a big issue there on family life. And like I said, people have lost their hope. There's a negative attitude in general pervading American society. Very, very tough, harsh environments. You can get sacked like that. So you've got to keep going and keep working. Those jobs are precious and they can be taken away from you very quickly. A really tough, rough environment. You'll certainly see that in Of Mice and Men. An environment, like I say, where there's very few women. Look at Of Mice and Men. There's only one female character in the whole thing. We never actually learn her real name. So that tells you just how respected she is within the farm society. There's still elements of racism around. Remember that this is the 1930s. So about 65 years earlier, America's still at war, a civil war, to abolish slavery. And there's still a lot of leftover attitudes towards that. So you'll see the black character in Of Mice and Men, that how he is treated in comparison to some of the others, and some of the language which is used towards him, which we find offensive, but which is treated as commonplace by the farm labourers. Also, disability. This is a harsh, tough environment. You get on with life, or you're in the way is the attitude. And so you'll also see an attitude towards disability with a couple of the characters as well. Life in the ranch in 1930s America is tough. Because of that as well, people relish escapism, a chance to somehow get away from the tough and unpleasant nature of their lives. And you see elements of this as well in the book. Hollywood, the cinema, this is when Hollywood really takes off. People want to spend a little bit of their money going off and just watching a more glamorous life, and so Hollywood movies become popular. Likewise, radio. There's no televisions, there's no games consoles, there's no internet then. Radio becomes the massive media, the one that everybody has access to, and becomes the centre of lots of people's lives. You'll see this referred to briefly in Of Mice and Men, the glamour of radio, the glamour of Hollywood. If you want an idea, a little bit of context on how the radio became the centre of people's lives, if you've got Netflix, have a look at Radio Days, with a cute, old-fashioned sort of comedy showing how the radio was the centre of a family's lives in the 1930s. And also, pulp fiction. Pulp fiction was basically rubbish books, adventure stories, for want of a better way of putting it, called pulp because it was made out of really cheap paper, the paper that would be pulped up to make into other books. This stuff was disposable. You read it, you throw it away, it gets pulped, gets thrown away itself, the actual material of the book. Pulp fiction, usually very lurid stories about detectives and about cowboys. And you'll also see this in the book. The men on the ranch are bored. They haven't got radio even. They want to do something to pass their time away. And some of them have these pulp fiction books, these really rather far-fetched stories about cowboys having adventures. And even though they know it's silly, really, it's a bit of escapism for them and they're able to enjoy it. Now, Steinbeck's good at understanding all this stuff. Steinbeck actually had a pretty decent upbringing himself, but he chose to find out more about working people. And he did go off voluntarily. He didn't need to financially, and work in a lot of the ranches. So he really understood these situations from the inside. A lot of his books reflect this. A lot of them are written about poverty. And most importantly, Steinbeck's writing really is influenced by a real sense of humanity in the man. He feels that every single human being deserves their chance, deserves their opportunity in life, and ought to be treated decently and equally. And that comes through in all his work, and particularly in Of Mice and Men, a book where we really learn to understand how the characters tick and feel real empathy for people who just want a bit of a better life for themselves.